One file, 12 pages, and 42 years of judicial silence shattered in a courtroom. What did Ibrahim Traoré expose that forced the Chief Justice of the United States to retreat in shame? The clock in the Supreme Court's private conference room ticked with an eerie rhythm, slow, methodical, like a gavel striking in slow motion. The overhead chandelier cast a soft glow on the polished mahogany table where 9 chairs stood in regal formation. But only 5 were occupied. It was not an official court day. It was something else. A meeting unannounced. A session unrecorded. A conversation never meant for history books. Chief Justice John Roberts adjusted his cufflink with deliberate ease. He was as always immaculate, silver blue tie, neatly combed hair, a half smile that could disarm a room without effort. But tonight there was a different weight behind his eyes, sharper, colder. Calculating. He placed a leather folder on the table and flipped it open. The others leaned in. Thin sheets of dense legal language footnotes stacked like bricks sprawled across the pages. The title read, Judicial Modernization and Structural Efficiency Act, Preliminary Framework. Justice Molina skimmed a page, frowning. This language under Section 4, state-level autonomy in electoral integrity matters, that's dangerously vague. Roberts barely looked up. Vague, yes. Intentionally. Language, my friend, is a scalpel, not a hammer. The others exchanged glances. Let's be clear. Roberts continued, lowering his voice. This package doesn't just streamline, it repositions. Voting rights provisions, especially from the 60s era, they no longer reflect the country we've become, or the country we're becoming. Justice Bell asked, almost a whisper. Exactly, Roberts replied, tapping his finger once on the folder. We guide change, not by shouting, but by suggestion. That's how precedent is quietly rewritten. From a shadowed corner just outside the chamber door, Eli Ward, a junior law clerk, barely 24, froze. He wasn't supposed to be there. He had come back after hours to retrieve a forgotten notebook. He had heard murmurs behind the door, and curiosity won. Now his heart was pounding so loudly in his chest he thought they might hear it through the oak. The door had been ajar just an inch, barely enough to see through, but his ears didn't need sight. Inside, the conversation continued, low and surgical. Section 6 will eliminate federal oversight in redistricting challenges, Roberts said, voice smooth as oil. It'll be sold as restoring state rights. No headlines, no protests, just erosion. Justice Molina shifted uncomfortably. You know what this will look like if someone reads between the lines. No one reads anymore, Roberts replied calmly, and those who do won't know where to look. A ripple of silence followed, heavy and knowing. Then Roberts added something that sent ice down Eli's spine. We don't reverse history, we redact it. At that moment, Eli stumbled back, just a half step, a shift of weight on the parquet floor, and the old board beneath his foot creaked. Roberts's head turned like a hawk. Silence. Eli bolted down the hall, adrenaline pushing him faster than he thought possible. He didn't stop running until he was out of the building phone, in hand lungs burning. And by the time he reached his apartment, fingers trembling, he had already typed the message. He hesitated a moment, then added, Try Ibrahim Traoré. Then he hit send. Back inside the Supreme Court, Roberts slowly closed the folder, eyes narrowing. Make sure the chamber is swept. Tonight. The late afternoon sun spilled golden light across the lecture hall at Howard University, casting long shadows on the rows of mahogany desks. The room was alive with discussion, not just about case law or court decisions, but about the soul of democracy itself. Ibrahim Traoré stood at the front, not behind the lectern, but among his students. He never liked distance. That he often said was the problem with institutions, too many people in marble buildings, talking at the world instead of listening to it. Law is language, he said, gesturing to a Supreme Court opinion projected on the screen. But language can be twisted. Tell me, how do you protect truth when it's dressed in legal robes? A young woman raised her hand. You unmask it, Ibrahim smiled. Good. But what if it doesn't want to be unmasked? There was a pause, a silence not of confusion, but thought. That was what he loved most about teaching. He wasn't training future lawyers. He was awakening guardians. After class, as students filed out, he returned to his office on the 3rd floor of the law building, a modest room filled with casebooks, protest posters, and a framed photo of his father standing on red earth back in Burkina Faso, holding a ballot with pride. He had barely set his satchel down when his phone buzzed. One new message, no subject, no sender, just a link. Suspicious. He clicked anyway. The email opened into a wall of text. At first glance, it looked like dry legislative jargon, the kind courts buried in footnotes. But a few phrases leapt out at him: federal oversight, rollback Section 4, historical precedent under revision, and most unsettling. Eliminate grounds for intervention in electoral district litigation. He narrowed his eyes. That phrase, that was not normal. Attached at the bottom was a brief line. They're hiding it in plain sight. Please watch. Listen. No name. No sign-off. His instinct said this could be nonsense conspiracy, misinterpretation, maybe even bait. But something about the phrasing, the deliberate vagueness, it didn't feel like a hoax. It felt calculated. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in months. It rang once. Then Ibrahim came the sharp, no-nonsense voice of Eleanor Whitford, retired Senator Lioness of Legal Reform, and the woman who once told him that truth was more dangerous when it was quiet. "I got something strange," he said. "You always do," she replied dryly. "What flavor this time?" He read her the memo slowly. She didn't interrupt. When he finished, there was a pause. Then her tone dropped an octave. "That's not legal reform. That's engineered erosion. So I'm not paranoid." "You should be more paranoid," she said flatly. "You're not dealing with a leak, Ibrahim. You're dealing with a shadow." He sat down slowly, as if the chair had grown heavier beneath him. "You think it's real?" She didn't hesitate. "I think it's deliberate. Truth doesn't whisper unless it's afraid." That phrase lodged in his chest like a stone. He looked again at the message, at the memo, at the subtle shift in language that no ordinary citizen would notice, but that a legal mind, a careful one, might. His classroom that morning had been about spotting distortion in plain sight. Now he was holding it in his hands, and suddenly he realized this wasn't just theory anymore. It was the beginning. The Liberty and Justice Forum was not the kind of event that usually made headlines. Held in a modest community auditorium just off U Street in D.C., it drew retired judges, student activists, public defenders, and a few sharp-eyed journalists who still believed the truth mattered more than trending topics. Tonight, the buzz in the room was palpable. Ibrahim Traoré stood backstage, hands clasped behind his back, listening as the moderator read his bio, a former UN legal fellow, civil rights strategist, and professor of constitutional law at Howard University. "Please welcome Ibrahim Traoré." Applause greeted him, warm and rising. He took the podium with his usual calm grace, scanning the faces before him. People from every walk of life, some angry, some exhausted, some simply curious, but all of them hungry for clarity in a country where justice felt more like a slogan than a system. "I was told once," he began, "that the Constitution is not a shield or a sword, but a mirror. It shows us who we are, but it can also hide what we don't want to see." He let that sit for a moment before continuing. "There's a growing narrative," he said, "that certain federal protections are outdated, that in the name of efficiency oversight should be scaled back, that voter protections should evolve with the times." He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that didn't soften, but sharpened. "But we know what that evolution means, don't we?" A few murmurs of agreement rolled through the crowd. "I've read the language," he went on. "I've seen the revisions buried under legal jargon. When someone tells you your rights are being streamlined, look at what's missing, not what's highlighted." He didn't name names. He didn't have to. The audience knew exactly what he was referring to, and more importantly, who. Somewhere across town, in a dimly lit private study, lined with rare law books and framed oaths of office, Chief Justice John Roberts sat in silence, watching a live stream of the speech on a private encrypted device. The image of Ibrahim speaking played out in clean high definition. There was no podium pounding, no call to riot, just something worse. Precision, logic, authority. Roberts leaned forward slightly, his jaw tightening. When Ibrahim said laws that tiptoe backwards often do so while pretending to move forward, Roberts' hand moved to the phone beside him. He dialed without looking. A deep voice answered. No greeting, no name, just breath. Roberts didn't bother with pleasantries. "We have a situation. Handle it." Then he hung up. Back at the auditorium, Ibrahim closed his remarks with a quote from Fannie Lou Hamer. "Nobody's free until everybody's free." That's not just rhetoric. That's reality one being quietly rewritten while we argue over headlines. The crowd erupted. Not in frenzy, but in respect. People stood. Elders nodded. Youth recorded. Someone live-streamed the final lines, and within hours it would reach nearly 1 million views. Ibrahim stepped off stage to thunderous applause. But as he walked down the corridor toward the exit, an uneasy sensation crept into his chest, like a thread being pulled behind his ribs. He passed a man in a pressed suit by the back entrance. No name tag, no handshake. Just a subtle nod and the quiet click of a shutter as the man took a photo. Outside, night had fallen and DC lights blinked like fireflies across the skyline. Ibrahim breathed in the crisp air, unaware that across the city multiple calls were being made. His name had just been added to several internal briefings. A file had been started. An old acquaintance at a media outlet had just received a tip about an alleged foreign donation to Ibrahim's community fund, entirely fabricated, but plausible enough to raise a brow. The rules had changed. Lines had been crossed. But Ibrahim didn't know that yet. He only knew that something had shifted in the room tonight, and perhaps even more dangerously outside of it. The game had begun. The fluorescent lights in the Ledger's archives room buzzed softly like a whisper, too persistent to ignore. Walls of paper files, news clippings, court transcripts, and financial disclosures surrounded the two figures hunched over an old oak table. Ibrahim Traoré, now less professor and more investigator, and Rosa Kim, one of the few journalists in the Capitol who still chased smoke before it became fire. Rosa pushed her glasses up, scanning the spreadsheet before her. "You're sure this is where the tip originated?" Ibrahim nodded, tapping a page filled with crisscrossing arrows, boxes, and hand-scribbled annotations. The language from the anonymous memo. It didn't just sound legal, it mimicked the tone of policy reviews from Civic Standard, that think tank based in Arlington. But look at their board. Rosa leaned closer. 3 former justices' aides, 2 campaign finance lawyers, and, oh hello, a Robert J. Madsen, listed as special counsel for judicial strategy. "Keep going," Ibrahim said. Rosa flipped to a tax document, her brows furrowing. Madsen also chairs a Shell Foundation in Delaware. It's routed millions into election integrity initiatives. But the grants don't lead to state offices. They lead to law firms. And all those firms, Ibrahim added, have submitted amicus briefs in favor of the proposed judicial reforms. She sat back, whistling low. That's a lot of ink for something no one's talking about. Ibrahim's voice was quieter now. That's the point. In the days since the Civil Rights Forum, he had been flooded with emails, some supportive, others suspiciously identical in tone, warning him to stay in your lane. But the real lead had come from an unnamed intern who had worked briefly with a nonpartisan oversight NGO. A single phrase in their message had chilled him. "You're chasing shadows, but one of them has a name, Slate Reset." He hadn't known what it meant, not until Rosa found a reference buried in a subfolder on a nonprofit's outdated site. It was a passing mention in a legal blog quickly removed from archives, but they had cached it. Now in Rosa's archive room, she unrolled a printed PDF with trembling fingers. At the top, Operation Slate Reset, strategic recommendations for judicial realignment and jurisprudential rehabilitation. Confidential, eyes only. Rosa looked at him. This isn't a think tank proposal, it's a blueprint. The document was thick, over 60 pages, and riddled with code names, legal references, and metrics for public acclamation strategies. It spoke of reshaping precedent, curating sympathetic clerks, and using subtextual alignment in legal opinions to pivot interpretation of existing civil rights statutes. Buried midway through was a chilling sentence. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 remains the most culturally embedded obstacle to efficient electoral redesign. Ibrahim stared at the line, his hands curling slowly into fists. They're not just redrawing lines, they're erasing history. Rosa scanned the footnote. This wasn't written for public consumption. It was written for execution. Outside, the night had fallen thick and heavy over Washington, but the tension in the room was brighter than any overhead light. "We'll need corroboration," Rosa said, already thinking aloud. "If this leaks as is, it'll get labeled fake within an hour. We need someone close to the inside, someone whose name means something." Eleanor Ibrahim murmured. Rosa blinked. Whitford isn't she? She's quiet, not out, but not gone. He stood carefully folding the document. If anyone can recognize this language and who's behind it, it's her. They packed the files in a nondescript brown folder, sealing it with tape. Rosa looked up at him. You realize if this is real, they'll do more than discredit you. They'll silence you. He looked her in the eyes, not with fear, but certainty. They've already started trying. Now it's our turn. And as they stepped into the cool wind outside, the distant sound of sirens echoed down the street, not urgent, but constant, like a warning written into the city's breath. They weren't chasing ghosts anymore. They had found the first shadow. It was just after 7 p.m. when Rosa Kim checked her phone again, scrolling through the same unanswered text messages she had sent over the past 12 hours. No reply, no read receipts, just silence. Drew Halperin, the Supreme Court Administrative Liaison, had agreed to meet her for coffee the previous morning. Off the record, he had said, "But you didn't get this from me." He'd sounded nervous but firm. Rosa had interviewed hundreds of sources. She could always tell when someone had something to say they weren't supposed to. He never showed up. She had waited 45 minutes in the corner booth of a diner 3 blocks from the court, sipping burnt coffee and staring out the window, watching the courthouse dome disappear slowly behind dusk. Drew never texted, never called. When she reached out again late that night, the number had already been disconnected. Now, a full day later, he was still gone. Rosa stood by her window, her fingers gripping the curtain's edge. Across the street, a black SUV had been parked for over an hour. No plates, no movement, just presence. She dialed Ibrahim. "He's missing," she said when he picked up. Drew, the staffer. "I think something's happened." There was silence on the line. Not disbelief, just the kind of pause that happens when fear slips into understanding. "Come by," Ibrahim said finally. "Now." By the time Rosa arrived at Ibrahim's apartment, the streetlights had flickered on, and the city had settled into the low hum of a weekday night. She was still gripping her messenger bag like a lifeline. Inside, Ibrahim was standing at his kitchen counter, staring at a small envelope lying on the table. It was unmarked except for his name typed neatly in all caps. "I found it in my mailbox when I got back from campus," he said. No stamp, no return address. He hadn't opened it. Rosa watched as he slowly peeled it open and pulled out a single slip of paper. Typed in the same mechanical font were the words, "Some walls should not be scratched. Yours are thin. No signature, no explanation, no demands. Just threat sharpened into suggestion." Rosa felt a chill coil down her back. "They're watching us." Ibrahim didn't answer right away. His eyes were still on the note, but his mind had gone somewhere deeper beyond the envelope, beyond the words. To the invisible machinery behind them. "They knew about Drew," he said quietly. "Maybe they reached him first." He walked to the window, pushing aside the curtain just enough to glance down at the street. The SUV across from Rosa's building wasn't there anymore, but that didn't comfort him. It only confirmed what he already feared. "This isn't about leaking documents anymore," he said. "This is about containment." Rosa looked at him. "Are you going to stop?" He turned back to face her, and for a moment she saw the exhaustion behind his eyes, the weight of knowing too much, too fast. But then it faded, replaced by the same resolve that had carried him through every courtroom, every protest, every moment when it would have been easier to walk away. "No," he said. "Now I know we're close." He folded the note once, then again, until it was no longer visible. Just paper, no fear. Outside, the wind picked up, and somewhere far above the rooftops, the first rumble of distant thunder rolled across the city. The old townhouse on East Capitol Street looked like it belonged to another century. White columns, creaking steps, a brass door knocker shaped like a lion's head. Inside, the scent of aged paper lemon tea and dust mixed with time. It was quiet, insulated, safe in its own way. Eleanor Whitford was seated in the sunroom when Ibrahim arrived, a wool blanket over her lap, and a half-read copy of the Federalist Papers beside her. Her gray hair was pinned back with the same tortoiseshell clip she'd worn for decades, and her voice, though raspier than it used to be, carried the same sharpness that once silenced entire Senate hearings. "You look like hell," she said without looking up. "I didn't come for compliments," Ibrahim replied, managing a faint smile. She motioned for him to sit. Tea's on the tray. Second shelf is brandy if you want something stronger. You'll need it. He poured himself tea. Brandy could wait. Eleanor reached beneath the throw blanket and pulled out a brown leather folder, worn the corners softened by time, but the label on the spine was crisp. J.R. Quiet Dockets 1985-1992. She handed it to him. That's your history lesson for the night. Ibrahim opened it, flipping slowly through the pages. Legal filings, internal memos, handwritten annotations. Names he recognized. Cases he didn't. Patterns that began to form with disturbing clarity. This is all from his time as Deputy Solicitor General, he asked. She nodded. And before. That man's fingerprints are all over civil rights rollbacks long before he wore a robe. One document caught Ibrahim's eye. A memo titled Alternative Procedural Framing for Limiting Title VI, Implications 1989. Beneath it, handwritten in the margin in dark ink, was a single sentence. We need to dull the blade, not ban the sword. Ibrahim read the line twice. That's him. Eleanor's jaw tightened. That memo blocked a DOJ push to expand federal protections for school desegregation. Roberts didn't argue against the merits. He argued the procedure was premature, and the expansion died in committee. That was his gift killing ideas before they took root without ever drawing blood. She stood slowly and walked to the window, gazing out at the Capitol dome. He believes in law the way a magician believes in illusion, not to serve, but to distract. And people fall for it every time. Ibrahim sat with the weight of the folder in his lap, feeling the edges dig into his thighs. Why keep this hidden? Because I thought he'd fade into the system, she said, but instead he built it around himself. She turned and looked at him no longer, the firebrand senator, but something quieter, wiser, sadder. You think this is about one ruling, one document? No, Ibrahim. He's not trying to kill your career. He's rewriting the script. Quietly, thoroughly, permanently. Ibrahim leaned forward. How do you fight someone who uses the law like fog? Eleanor returned to her chair, her bones audibly settling. You clear the air, she said, and then you light a fire. He flipped to the final page of the folder, a chart connecting Roberts to 3 current think tanks, 2 anonymous donors, and a now-defunct law review article proposing jurisdictional insulation from public legal challenge. At the bottom of the chart, circled in red, were the words Slate Reset, drafted from prior doctrine, Model 1989, memo Ibrahim exhaled. The document Rosa had found wasn't new. It was the culmination of decades. He's been planting seeds for 30 years, Ibrahim whispered. And now they're blooming, Eleanor said. Outside, the wind tugged at the magnolia tree by the gate. A leaf tapped rhythmically against the glass. Eleanor looked toward it, then back at Ibrahim, her eyes fierce. Whatever you decide next, you don't do it for glory. You do it because one day, someone will ask what you did when truth stood on trial, and your answer will echo. Ibrahim closed the folder. Then it's time we made it loud. The studio lights were too bright, even for a man used to standing in front of classrooms and courtrooms. Ibrahim Traoré adjusted his mic discreetly, fingers brushing the collar of his charcoal suit. The host smiled at him across the sleek glass table, a rehearsed, polished grin that didn't quite reach her eyes. The round table was billed as a discussion on judicial ethics and transparency in modern America, streamed live on 3 major networks and pushed hard on social media in the days leading up to the taping. What wasn't advertised, however, was the guest list. Ibrahim had been told it would be a balanced group of legal scholars and civic leaders. But now, as the lights dimmed and the cameras powered on, he realized something was off. To his left sat Glenn Harrow, a legal commentator, known more for his political punditry than jurisprudence. Next to him, Marla Givens, a former prosecutor turned influencer whose online following fed on controversy like oxygen. And across the table, the surprise late addition, Douglas Wren, a longtime associate of Roberts and former deputy chief of staff under a previous administration. The host began the segment with a smooth monologue about the growing tension between public accountability and judicial independence. Ibrahim nodded along, cautious but prepared, until she pivoted. Professor Traoré, she said, turning her full attention to him. You've recently spoken out about supposed secret efforts to rewrite voter protections. Do you have concrete evidence for these claims? I've presented legal documentation, he replied evenly. What I've said is supported by a trail of funding influence and institutional language shifts. The public has a right to transparency. Marla leaned forward theatrically, flipping through a folder. Would you also say the public has a right to know if the people calling for that transparency are themselves? Entirely clean, Ibrahim's brow furrowed. Glenn jumped in before he could speak. Because we've obtained a set of emails, he said, lifting a printed page for the camera between you and a foreign donor, a political entity based in West Africa. These communications raise serious questions about foreign influence on domestic legal activism. For a moment, the air thickened. Ibrahim stared at the page, reading words he had never written. These are doctored, he said calmly. Fabricated. Marla smirked. The metadata disagrees. These were verified by an independent forensic analyst just this morning. Whose analyst, he asked. Someone who doesn't work for a man who thinks the Constitution is up for interpretation, Glenn replied with venom. The moderator allowed the moment to sit long enough for the viewers to let their doubts settle. Ibrahim could almost feel the comments pouring in real-time reactions, flashing across social platforms. The narrative was writing itself before he could catch up. He tried to steady his voice. You invited me here to speak on judicial ethics. Instead, you've turned this into a spectacle built on lies. And we'll let the viewers decide, the host said, signaling a break. Off air, Glenn winked at him. Welcome to prime time, Professor. Backstage, Ibrahim stood motionless, while production assistants buzzed around him. His phone vibrated with dozens of notifications. Headlines were already breaking. Traoré accused of foreign ties amid judicial transparency campaign, whistleblower or operative DC. Professor under fire, Supreme Showdown turns political. By the time he stepped outside into the humid night, the city had already begun turning. Strangers glanced at him too long. A man across the street lifted his phone, subtly filming. He had gone from advocate to suspect in less than a broadcast hour. And then came the interview. Chief Justice John Roberts, standing on the marble steps of a federal building, flanked by clerks, addressed the press with ease and control. We are protectors of law, he said, not manipulators of fear. The judiciary must not be swayed by theatrics or conspiracy. No names. No direct accusations. But the message was clear. Roberts didn't need to silence Ibrahim with threats anymore. He had something far more effective, doubt sharpened into spectacle. And now the real trial had begun. The silence hit harder than the accusations. 2 days after the televised roundtable, Ibrahim Traoré sat in his office at Howard University staring at his inbox. Not a single message from donors, partners, or colleagues. The inbox, once filled with speaking requests, student inquiries, and collaboration offers, was now a graveyard of cancellations and unsubscriptions. A soft knock broke the quiet. It was Latoya, his administrative coordinator. She stepped inside, cautiously holding a folded letter. They overnighted this, she said, avoiding eye contact. He opened it without speaking. It was from Civic Harmony Foundation, his largest funder, a group that once praised him for restoring faith in legal discourse. The letter was cold, formal, corporate. In light of recent controversy and public uncertainty surrounding your actions and affiliations, we are indefinitely suspending our financial partnership with the Liberty Docket Initiative, pending further review. No signature, just a typed name and title. He placed it gently on the desk. Thank you, Latoya. She hesitated. For what it's worth, I know you. I know what you stand for. But even her voice lacked conviction. Later that day, Ibrahim walked into his advanced constitutional law seminar. The class, usually a lively discussion space, felt different. Students avoided his gaze. The back rows, once full, sat empty. Even the ones who stayed seemed withdrawn, uncomfortable. He began the lecture, something on due process and the manipulation of judicial precedent, but the words felt heavier. Less like teaching, more like surviving. After class, only one student stayed behind Micah, quiet, bookish, always prepared. Micah didn't ask a question. He just stood there holding his notebook. They say you took money from a foreign group, he said plainly. I didn't. Micah nodded slowly. I believe you, but it's everywhere. Then he left. No thank you. No see you next week. Just absence. Across the city, Rosa Kim stood at her editor's desk at the Ledger, holding the early draft of her report in one hand and her job in the other. Her editor, Bill Harmon, a newsroom veteran with 1 Pulitzer and 3 ulcers, stared at her with tired eyes. "You're good," he said. "But you're not invincible." Rosa placed the folder on his desk. "The story is solid. The evidence is real." Bill sighed. "Doesn't matter. Legal's already breathing down my neck. If we run this and it blows up, we lose more than ad money. The board wants it shelved. For how long indefinitely?" She didn't move. He leaned forward. "Drop the story, Rosa, or you're out." She left the office without replying, gripping the edge of her file so hard her knuckles went white. By evening, Ibrahim sat alone in his apartment, blinds half drawn, the city glowing faintly beyond the windows. His phone buzzed again. Another sponsor pulling out. Another unsigned message laced with suspicion. Online hashtags that once supported him were now mocking him. He looked at his reflection in the dark glass. The quiet professor turned advocate, now painted as a liar, an opportunist, even a threat. He wasn't afraid of standing alone. But this was something else. This was erasure. Deliberate, quiet, precise. They weren't trying to fight him. They were trying to unwrite him. The night air in D.C. had turned crisp. Autumn was starting to bite through the warmth of late summer, and with it came a strange stillness that Ibrahim hadn't felt in years, a quiet that didn't comfort, but cautioned. His apartment was dark, lit only by the low blue hum of his laptop screen. He hadn't slept. Not really. Not since the ambush on national television. Not since sponsors pulled out. Not since Rosa stopped responding to texts. The only thing more deafening than the noise was the silence that followed it. He refreshed his inbox out of habit, mostly spam. Now a few veiled threats and one notification marked unverified sender. He almost ignored it. Almost. But the subject line caught his eye. "We remember Ouagadougou." His heart skipped. He clicked. The message was plain text, no signature, no embedded links. "Professor Traoré, you don't know us, but we remember you. We were stationed in Burkina Faso in '07. You came into a war camp in the northern region. You were working with a civil liberties group, then arguing that children used as messengers for militias should be treated as victims, not enemies. You won that argument. 2 kids we were ordered to detain were released. They both survived. One of them lives in Kansas now. We've watched what they're doing to you here. The tactics, the silence, the smear. We know what this is. You're fighting something bigger than you, bigger than the courts. Don't stop. They're counting on your isolation. So here we are. Still here. Veterans for democratic integrity." Ibrahim read the message 3 times. He hadn't thought about that camp in years. About the heat, the dust, the distrust in the soldiers' eyes. About the boy Samuel, that was his name, trembling in a cell meant for grown men. He leaned back in his chair, breath heavy in his lungs. Something inside him shifted, something small but sharp. Not defiance, not yet, but heat. He stood walking to his bookshelf, reaching behind a stack of legal textbooks to pull out an old photo. A grainy image of him standing between 2 boys' fists raised a faded red observer badge clipped to his belt. One of the boys had scrawled "Merci" on the back in red ink. They hadn't forgotten, so why had he? He looked around his apartment, once a quiet retreat, now a cage of hesitation and second-guessing. Every wall whispered, "You're finished." Every silence said, "You're alone." But the message proved otherwise. He walked back to the computer, opened a new document, and began typing. Not a legal brief, not a memo, a statement. If the courts won't listen, maybe the people will. We are being told to wait, to trust, to silence our instincts while our rights are surgically revised behind closed doors. This is not about ego. This is about erasure. I will no longer fight this battle behind redacted documents and camera filters. If they want the public silent, then the public must speak. Loudly, visibly, unapologetically. He paused, then added a final line. They tried to isolate me. Instead, they reminded me who's watching. He sent the statement to Rosa. No subject line, just the document. An hour later, she replied with 2 words, "I'm in." At dawn, Ibrahim stepped outside for the first time in 2 days. The streets were still wet from the early rain, and the city was waking up with the sluggish breath of bureaucracy. But something had changed. Not in the skyline, not in the traffic, but inside him. He wasn't asking for permission anymore. They wanted to control the narrative. Fine. He would rewrite it not through the courts but through the people who still believed this country was meant to belong to all of them. The wind picked up. His coat flapped behind him like a banner waiting for a mass, and somewhere deep in the marrow of the Capitol something stirred. The website launched on a Tuesday morning quietly without press releases or promotional buzz. Just a link posted by Ibrahim Traoré with a single caption: "If silence is neutrality, then clarity is resistance. Read everything, then decide for yourself." Within hours, the link was everywhere. The Liberty docket was unlike anything the public had seen before. It wasn't just a whistleblower dump or an angry blog. It was methodical, structured, elegant in its restraint. It categorized key rulings, draft memos, donation records, and obscure amicus briefs, all linked with plain language summaries and annotations that exposed patterns, years of carefully crafted jurisprudence that pointed to a chilling strategy. Use legal neutrality as camouflage. Each entry had two columns: what it said and, more importantly, what it meant. Subtle rewrites of voting law, quiet reversals of precedent, procedural updates that disproportionately impacted marginalized voters. Language that seemed bland until you saw what disappeared. At the top of the homepage, a quote blinked in white against a black background: "They're not dismantling rights, they're redesigning them to disappear." By noon, the site had 80,000 unique visitors. By nightfall, it crossed 1.2 million. And then came the voices. A retired judge from Ohio, once a moderate Republican, shared the site with a message: "I tried to pretend we weren't heading here. I can't anymore." A Vietnam War veteran who hadn't spoken publicly in 2 decades uploaded a video: "I fought abroad for rights. They're quietly erasing here." Traoré's not making this up. He's the only one spelling it out. A church coalition in Atlanta dedicated an entire Sunday to unpacking the contents of the Liberty docket in their sermons. Even Rosa's editor at the Ledger, who had benched her just a week before, emailed her privately: "I was wrong. You're not chasing ghosts, you're documenting a quiet war. Let's talk print." Cable news picked it up first as a curiosity. Howard professor launches legal database. But the numbers spoke for themselves. The comments section wasn't angry, it was galvanized. More surprisingly, people weren't just reacting online, they were organizing. In Detroit, a retired law librarian offered to host weekend workshops on constitutional rights interpretation. In Phoenix, a group of high school history teachers built an open-access curriculum around the docket's case studies. In Charleston, a grassroots legal aid network began translating every page into Spanish, Swahili, and Vietnamese. It wasn't just students and activists, it was veterans, librarians, deacons, truckers, barbers, librarians, mothers with old law degrees, pastors with worn-out copies of the Constitution. They called it the Quiet Coalition, not because they were silent, but because they had always been silent, and now they were done waiting. Ibrahim sat in a cramped workspace above a borrowed law office near U Street, watching the live analytics map flicker like a heartbeat monitor. Red dots were popping up across the country. He wasn't trending anymore. He was moving people. He looked up at Rosa, who had been compiling submissions from new whistleblowers since morning. "Did you expect this?" She shook her head, half smiling. "Not this fast, not this loud." He paused. "They'll push back harder now." "They already are," she said, flipping her screen to show a major outlet's hit piece calling the Liberty docket legally reckless and dangerous disinformation disguised as activism. But the article had more comments defending it than attacking. "What do we do next?" she asked. Ibrahim didn't answer immediately. He scrolled to a new user-submitted file titled "Confirmed Internal Memo from Judicial Strategy Group." Refers to Phase 2 of Slate Reset. He stared at the file name for a long moment. Now he said, "Now we show them that clarity isn't a threat. It's a mirror. Let them see what they've become." Outside, car horns hummed and shoes clattered against sidewalks, but the Capitol felt different, like it had taken a breath it didn't know it was holding. In the hands of everyday people, the law was beginning to glow again, not as a weapon or a cage, but as a light. It was a pristine morning in Washington, the kind journalists call photogenic. The sky was pale blue, no wind, no clouds, no noise, but the soft rustle of flags outside the Supreme Court. At precisely 10:00 a.m., the press gathered at the foot of the marble steps, cameras lined like soldiers. The email had gone out only hours earlier. Chief Justice John Roberts will deliver a brief statement regarding recent commentary on judicial conduct. He stepped out alone, no entourage, no robe, just a tailored gray suit and the confident poise of a man used to making the final words sound like scripture. His face betrayed nothing. He began with a smile that didn't quite touch his eyes. In the past several weeks, we have witnessed a flurry of commentary, speculation, and outright accusations aimed at the integrity of this court. While public scrutiny is a healthy feature of any democracy, I must emphasize the distinction between constructive engagement and baseless attack. Cameras clicked in bursts. This institution does not bend to political pressure, nor does it yield to viral outrage. We are guided by precedent, principle, and process, not partisanship. He paused, letting the words settle. Any suggestion that this court is engaged in covert political restructuring is not only unfounded, it is irresponsible. Judicial independence is not a talking point. It is the cornerstone of the rule of law. Then a final line, smooth, precise. We do not answer to algorithms, hashtags, or headlines. We answer to the Constitution. No questions were taken. He turned and walked back up the steps, disappearing behind the doors. The statement aired across all major news outlets within the hour. Most commentators noted its tone, calm but firm. Yet underneath the performance pressure was quietly building. Behind the court's closed doors, the atmosphere had changed. In chambers, Justice Molina, usually an institutionalist loyal to Roberts' procedural philosophies, set her glasses down on the oak table after watching the statement replay. "We're not politicians, John," she said evenly. "But we also aren't beyond question. This doesn't go away with platitudes." Justice Bell, seated across from her, nodded. The docket site didn't just throw stones. It laid out connections. Real ones. If even half of it holds up under scrutiny, we're sitting on a credibility collapse. Roberts remained seated at the head of the table, spine straight, hands folded. "It holds no legal weight," he said. "But public trust does," Molina replied. "You've guided us by steering clear of controversy for years. But this isn't strategic silence. This is opacity." He didn't respond. For a moment, the room went still. Justice Bell leaned in. "You may survive the politics, but the institution might not." Outside, the statement echoed across talk shows and op-ed pages, praised by some as statesmanlike, condemned by others as evasive. But within the walls that mattered most, doubt had entered the chambers. And doubt, once spoken aloud in a room of justices, was rarely silent again. The bar wasn't anything special: faux brick walls, overpriced bourbon, dim lighting, designed to make everyone feel exclusive. Rosa Kim had been here before, usually for late-night drinks with reluctant sources, but tonight she sat alone, her phone set to record its lens peeking discreetly through the folds of her wool scarf draped over her purse. Across from her sat Daniel Kerner, a senior policy strategist for the American Jurisprudence Advancement Group, a name that sounded noble, civic-minded, patriotic. In reality, they were one of the most well-funded legal lobbying groups in the Capitol. Their board included ex-judges, former law professors, and more crucially, several close allies of Chief Justice John Roberts. Kerner didn't know he was being recorded. He sipped his old-fashioned with the casual entitlement of someone who'd never had to explain himself. "Look, Rosa, I know you've got a job to do," he said, "but let's not pretend every ruling is just about what's on the page." She raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" He leaned in, lowering his voice, pleased with the sound of his own cleverness. "There's a rhythm to judicial behavior. You don't push doctrine openly, you seed it. Memo here, footnote there. Opinion phrased a certain way. Then 10 years later, boom, precedent." Rosa blinked, careful not to react. "You're saying the court is being coached," he chuckled. "Call it guided. Coached makes it sound like Roberts is sending out playbooks. No. That's the beauty of it. We just frame the questions they're already eager to answer." She let silence hang, pretending to sip her drink, then softly asked, and slate reset. Kerner's grin flickered, not gone, but suddenly guarded. "That's just a concept paper, mostly theoretical, legal architecture stuff. No one's pushing it officially." He leaned back, finishing his drink. "You want advice? Don't dig too deep. The public doesn't want to believe the court's political. They want robes and marble. Let them have it. He left $100 bill under the glass and disappeared into the crowd. Rosa waited a full 3 minutes before picking up her phone. Her hands were shaking, but her breath was steady. She played the audio back. The file was clean. The next morning, the clip was anonymously uploaded to several whistleblower channels, cut down to 3 minutes of clear audio, subtitled and timestamped. We just framed the questions they're already eager to answer. Seeded. Memo here, footnote there. Don't dig too deep. It spread like wildfire. News anchors dissected it. Activists replayed it during rallies. Legal analysts were forced to respond. The term slate reset, once dismissed as conspiracy, was now trending across the country. Within 48 hours, Congress reacted. Moderate Republicans, pushed by a wave of constituent pressure and mounting media scrutiny, joined Democrats in calling for transparency. The Speaker of the House, under public pressure, issued a joint statement with the Senate Judiciary Committee. In light of recent disclosures and growing concern over judicial influence from private legal networks, a bipartisan subcommittee will be formed to hold an open hearing on the matter of judicial transparency and integrity. The hearing was scheduled in less than a week. Ibrahim read the news while sitting on a park bench in Malcolm X Plaza, the sun warming his shoulders, his phone buzzing nonstop. Beside him, Rosa scrolled through reactions on her feed, watching the public narrative mutate in real time. "You changed the game," he said quietly. She didn't look up. "You lit the match. I just recorded the fire." He smiled. "You're coming with me to the hearing." She raised an eyebrow. "As what is proof?" Across the plaza, 2 high school students were sitting under a tree, passing a tablet back and forth, watching the Kerner recording on loop. Rosa watched them for a moment, then said, "You think this changes anything long-term?" "I don't know," Ibrahim admitted. "But they wanted this to be invisible. Now it's on every screen in the country." He stood looking out toward the Capitol dome in the distance. "They tried to shape silence," he said. "Now let's see how they handle noise." The sky above Capitol Hill was heavy with cloud. Not quite gray, not quite bright, as if even the weather was holding its breath. Outside the Senate office building, barricades lined the steps. Cameras blinked from every angle, their lenses fixed not on senators or aides, but on a man stepping out of a rideshare sedan with a single black briefcase in hand. Ibrahim Traoré adjusted his collar as he climbed the marble steps. The crowd that waited was loud, split alive with contrast. Some chanted his name, Traoré, Traoré, holding signs that read, "Protect the people's vote and truth has standing." Others booed with equal conviction, shouting slurs accusing him of treason, of foreign influence, of undermining judicial tradition. The cameras caught every step. Inside, the marble halls of the Capitol carried the sound of every footfall like a drumbeat. Staffers whispered behind columns. Journalists leaned forward, waiting to catch fragments of meaning. Security was tighter than usual, and every badge was double-checked. As Ibrahim approached the chamber doors, he paused. Rosa Kim met him there, wearing a muted gray blazer, phone off notepad tucked beneath her arm. She didn't speak, she just nodded. He nodded back. The doors opened. The hearing chamber was packed. Every seat on the dais was filled. Senators, aides, legal counsel, constitutional scholars, brought in as expert observers. On the wall above the chairperson's bench hung a massive American flag, and behind the elevated table sat the bipartisan subcommittee tasked with investigating judicial transparency. Every seat in the public gallery was occupied. The press booth buzzed. Live streams ran on 6 different platforms. Thousands were watching in real time. Millions would watch the replay. Ibrahim took his seat at the witness table, placing his briefcase down with care. His fingers were steady, but his pulse pressed in his ears like thunder under glass. And then silence fell like a curtain. Because the main door opened again. Chief Justice John Roberts entered. The room did not erupt. It tightened. He moved like a man born into ceremony, his every step measured precise. He wore his robe not required in this setting, but chosen. Symbolism was never accidental with Roberts. He carried no briefcase, no files, only a slim notepad and a Mont Blanc pen. He gave a slight nod to the chairwoman, Senator Alina Krauss, then glanced briefly at Ibrahim. His expression was unreadable. Calm, controlled, maybe even serene, but behind his eyes something flickered. Not surprise, not anger, Calculation. He took his seat a few feet away, but worlds apart. Senator Kraus tapped the gavel. "This hearing will come to order," she said. "Today we gather not to challenge the authority of the court, but to examine the integrity of its process and to ask whether recent revelations demand greater transparency from those who hold its highest seats." The opening statements began. Senators postured, some measured, some openly hostile, others cautiously supportive. Words like oversight, neutrality, activism, and subversion circled the room like crows. But through it all, Ibrahim sat still, his palms flat against the polished wood, feeling the tremor in the ground beneath his feet, not fear, but energy, the weight of something larger than himself taking shape. His name was called. He stood. The microphones were adjusted. The room fell into a stillness that was not silence. It was anticipation, thick as fog, breathless. "Ibrahim Traoré," he said, voice even. "Constitutional law educator, legal advocate, citizen." He paused. "I have not come here to attack. I have come here to reveal, to name what has long gone unnamed, the quiet reshaping of judicial neutrality into judicial theater." Behind him, a murmur rippled through the press. And across the table, Roberts sat like a statue, motionless, but with eyes sharp as glass. The match had been lit, and the chamber was full of kindling. The chamber lights felt hotter now. The silence had sharpened. Ibrahim Traoré adjusted the microphone, opened his briefcase, and pulled out a slim folder labeled Exhibit A. He didn't rush. Every movement was purposeful, practiced, but beneath his steady breath was the weight of knowing he was about to make enemies, not just in power, but in history. He stood before the committee. "Madam Chair, distinguished senators, I present to you not a theory, but a trail." He unfolded a diagram, clicking a remote that lit up the screen behind him. A web of names and dates appeared: think tanks, law firms, anonymous donors, and opinion authors. The same names circled multiple times, embedded in cases spanning more than a decade. "This," he continued, "is the architecture behind what I call judicial shaping, the deliberate insertion of language, funding, and influence into cases and clerks and commentary, all pointing toward an ideological realignment framed as modernization." He moved through Exhibit B, amicus briefs with near-identical language submitted by 3 different legal entities, independent on the surface. But their funding traces back to a single advisory board, the same board that employed Mr. Daniel Kerner, whose voice you all heard in the leaked audio. Gasps stirred across the room. He reached for Exhibit C, a printed memo from 1989, bearing the same rhetorical style as the recently leaked Slate Reset draft. "These strategies are not new," he said. "They are refined, quiet, often legal. But legality does not always equal integrity." He took a final breath, then played a 20-second clip of Kerner's voice piped through the chamber speakers. "You don't push doctrine openly, you seed it. Memo here, footnote there." The sound faded. The silence that followed was weightier than applause. But then Roberts spoke. He leaned forward, folding his hands like a patient surgeon. "Well," he said, voice smooth, "that was quite the presentation. A thriller even. Diagrams, audio clips, conspiracy theories dressed in moral clothing. I half expected a chalkboard with red string." A few senators chuckled nervously. "I have served this court with integrity," Roberts continued. "I have upheld the law, not rewritten it. To suggest that legal influence equals corruption is not only reckless, it's dangerous. If every brief filed becomes evidence of conspiracy, we no longer live in a system of law. We live in paranoia." He sat back, certain, controlled. Ibrahim stepped to the microphone again. For a moment, he said nothing. His jaw tensed. His voice, when it came, cracked, not from fear, but from something raw, deeper. "I don't believe in conspiracies," he said softly. "I believe in patterns." The room stilled. "I believe that when the same language appears in unrelated rulings, when clerks move from boardrooms to benches unnoticed, when policy becomes precedent without public debate, something larger is happening." He glanced briefly at Roberts. "This is not paranoia, it's a mirror. And what we're seeing isn't just process, it's design." He stepped back, folder in hand. The tension in the air was no longer abstract. It had a pulse. Across the dais, several senators exchanged looks. Some scribbled notes furiously. Others sat still, as if absorbing a shift they hadn't expected to feel. And for the first time since the hearing began, Roberts looked less certain. The room had begun to breathe again, slowly, unevenly. After Ibrahim's final statement, even the senators who had worn their skepticism like armor now sat differently, back straighter, notes forgotten. But no one had spoken for a full 30 seconds. That kind of silence in a government building was rare, fragile, pregnant with consequence. Then, just as Senator Krause leaned toward the mic to call the next session witness, a rustle came from the back of the chamber. A woman stood, elderly, elegant, walking slowly but deliberately, flanked by two aides. One of them carried a battered leather briefcase, the kind long out of fashion. Her silver hair was neatly tied back, her presence undeniable even before her name was spoken. "Madam Chair," came her voice, unmistakable in its crisp clarity. "With the committee's permission, I'd like to testify." The chamber stirred like water hit by wind. Senator Krause blinked. Ms. Whitford gasps echoed across the gallery. Even several senators leaned forward in disbelief. Eleanor Whitford, former senator, former ethics chair, retired, reclusive, revered. "I believe," she said as she approached the center table, "this room deserves something more than denial." Roberts shifted in his seat. For the first time all morning, the calm broke ever so slightly. A flicker of recognition, then something sharper. Eleanor placed the leather briefcase on the table. She opened it without theatrics, pulling from it a manila folder marked in faded red ink. "Confidential. Chambers use only." Inside, she removed a memo, a single-page document yellowed slightly with age, signed in precise handwriting. "I submit to this committee an internal memorandum dated March 12, 2013, authored by then-clerk Darren Foley, assigned to Chief Justice Roberts. The document was not meant for the public, but I received it during my final months in the Senate. I kept it against advice because I believed one day it would matter." She handed it to the clerk. The document was passed to the chair, who read silently before blinking in visible alarm. Senator Krause turned to the microphone, her voice thinner than usual. "The memo includes the following language, attributed directly to discussions with the Chief Justice. We cannot overturn precedent, but we can outgrow it. Slowly, if interpretation is controlled, revision will follow. Give it a decade, and even the sacred looks outdated." The room exploded. Cameras clicked like gunfire. Staffers rose from their seats. The public gallery gasped aloud. Even senators who had remained quiet now whispered to each other in anxious clusters. Roberts' expression froze. His lips parted slightly, not quite a denial, not quite surprise. Senator Bell, until now reserved, asked sharply, "Chief Justice Roberts, did you instruct your clerk to write this?" Roberts leaned forward. "This document, if authentic, is being taken wildly out of context. A conversation about the evolution of legal theory is not an admission of manipulation." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "Context doesn't change intent, John. We serve the people, not the institution." Roberts exhaled, short audible. Another senator called out, "We'll need to subpoena the original clerk, confirm authorship, confirm its authenticity." More voices followed. The hearing, once rigid in protocol, had become a current, surging, loud, impossible to control. Ibrahim remained seated, watching the chamber shift around him. He had spoken logic. Rosa had delivered evidence. But Eleanor had brought memory, and memory couldn't be refuted. Across the gallery, Rosa stood silently, recording everything, knowing the clip would go viral before the hearing even ended. Inside the chamber, order was fading. Senator Krause slammed the gavel once. Then again. "This committee will reconvene after recess. We need to process this new submission. No statements until review is complete." But the murmurs didn't stop. The mask had cracked. For years, Roberts had hidden behind the authority of language, behind robes and marble and quiet influence. But now his own words, delivered through time and witness, had turned the room. And everyone knew it. The footage was everywhere. By dawn the next day, Rosa Kim's recording the audio of Daniel Kerner, describing how doctrine is seated, had been verified by 3 independent forensic labs, each confirming the file was original, unaltered, and time-stamped within legal chain of custody standards. CNN ran the clip every 30 minutes. MSNBC dedicated an hour-long segment to dissecting the language. Even Fox News, under pressure from its own legal contributors, hosted a roundtable titled, "Have We Been Lied To by the Bench?" But it wasn't just the media anymore. Retired Justice Harold Klein, a conservative jurist who once clerked under William Rehnquist, wrote a scathing editorial in The Atlantic. The Supreme Court is not immune to influence. Roberts' silence in the face of mounting evidence does not protect the court, it fractures its foundation. Judge Lillian Ross, a respected liberal voice and former dean of Yale Law, echoed the sentiment on PBS. This isn't about political sides. It's about process. If rulings are quietly shaped by back-channel strategy groups, then judicial independence isn't just in danger, it's already compromised. Across law schools, classrooms paused scheduled lectures to break down the slate reset theory. Panels were assembled overnight, forums filled. Twitter threads from legal historians exploded with comparisons to Bush versus Gore, Citizens United, and now Roberts via accountability. In Washington, the effect was almost visceral. Protesters gathered not just outside the Capitol, but at the steps of the Supreme Court itself. For the first time in decades, chants echoed against the marble. "No robe above review. Truth has precedent. We see you now." The press office for the Chief Justice remained silent for 36 hours. Then finally an update: Chief Justice Roberts will not be attending the scheduled judicial symposium at Georgetown Law this week. A second appearance, a keynote at the Federalist Society Gala, was also canceled without explanation. Then came the photo. Snapped from a distance by a freelance photographer, the image showed Roberts stepping into a black SUV outside his private residence. No aides, no statement. His face unreadable, but the posture unmistakable withdrawal. Cable news ran the photo on loop, not as evidence, but as symbol of a man used to shaping the conversation, now slipping out the side door. Inside, the court sources began to whisper, not maliciously, but with something closer to disbelief. Clerks talked about being kept out of recent deliberations. Staffers quietly asked if Roberts would step down before the next term. But the loudest shift wasn't in Washington, it was in the public. In diners, community halls, bookstores, and college campuses, people discussed judicial process for the first time in years. Not just what was ruled, but how. Memes were made, student groups formed, local news stations held call-in segments. A grandmother in Minnesota wrote a letter to her senator: "I may not understand all the legal parts, but I know when someone's hiding something." In his apartment, Ibrahim watched it unfold in real-time TV, muted eyes, tired phone buzzing every few minutes with headlines and quotes and retweets. He didn't feel triumphant, not yet. He felt the weight of something shifting like an avalanche that had finally broken loose. And somewhere inside that noise, beneath the media frenzy and political scrambling, was the sound he had been waiting for. Accountability, not whispered, not buried, but spoken. Finally. The office was sleek, all brushed chrome and glass, an open view of the Capitol dome, framed behind a desk too clean to be real. The kind of place where decisions were made in tones softer than thunder, but with consequences just as loud. Ibrahim Traoré sat opposite a deputy chief of staff to the Speaker of the House, a woman in her 40s, smart-eyed, efficient, and not unkind. "We want you on board," she said, sliding a file across the desk. "Advisory role, task force on judicial transparency and reform. You'd have real input, Ibrahim, policy-making authority. We need voices like yours shaping what comes next." Ibrahim didn't open the file. He looked out the window instead. The dome stood silent, unmoving, as if it too was listening. "You don't trust us," she said softly. "It's not that," he replied. "I trust the moment. I trust what's been revealed. But this isn't my seat to take." She raised an eyebrow. "You fought to get here." "No," he said, finally meeting her gaze. "I fought so we could all see it more clearly." He stood, sliding the unopened folder gently back toward her. "I'm not here to become part of the system," he said. "I'm here to remind it of its roots." She didn't push. She just nodded, a little slower this time, as though his refusal carried more authority than any title they could offer. That same afternoon, Rosa Kim stood at the threshold of the Ledger's newsroom, looking not at the editor's desk, but at the corner cubicle they had cleared out for her, now reinstated, relabeled, and upgraded. The nameplate outside read "Rosa Kim, columnist, legal insight, and civic power." Her first column was already on the front page of the site and climbing, "When the system pretends to be neutral." Truth must be loud. Bill Harmon, her once skeptical editor, approached with a sheepish smile. "We want 2 columns a week," he said. "And your podcast idea is greenlit. Full budget. You built this thing into something bigger than news." She gave a half smile. "I didn't build it. I just pressed record." He chuckled. "Well, keep pressing." Later that evening, she and Ibrahim met at a quiet cafe a few blocks from Union Station. No cameras, no press, just a pot of tea between them and the low human hum of the city settling into night. "They offered me a seat," Ibrahim said. Rosa raised an eyebrow. "And I left the chair empty." She leaned back, folding her arms. "You realize people will call that foolish." "They already have," he said. "But I think the system needs a mirror more than it needs another voice inside the room." She sipped her tea, eyes thoughtful. "Then let's keep building mirrors," she said. "Big, unforgiving ones." Outside, the wind stirred the flags above Capitol Hill. No headlines blared. No breaking news interrupted the quiet. But something in the air had shifted, not final, not fixed, but different. And in that difference, the truth had found something rare. Staying power. The statement came quietly. No press conference. No dramatic reading from the steps. Just a 3-paragraph release posted to the Supreme Court's official website under the headline, "Statement on Judicial Process in Internal Review Measures." It outlined a series of changes: a formal ethics code for justices, a transparent clerk's disclosure protocol, new public access channels for amicus brief documentation, and most notably the creation of a Judicial Oversight Liaison Committee, something once unthinkable, now undeniable. No names were mentioned. Not Roberts, not Slate Reset, not Ibrahim Traoré. But everyone knew why it was happening, and more importantly, they knew who had forced it to happen. Across the country, the reaction was not one of celebration, but something quieter, stronger, relief, cautious optimism. A breath slowly exhaled after being held too long. At Howard University, students gathered outside the law building, chalking quotes from the Liberty docket across the pavement. In Des Moines, a high school civics teacher printed the reforms and pinned them to the bulletin board under the sign "Proof that Pressure Works." In Oakland, a veterans group hosted a live reading of the leaked memo that had changed everything, ending with a toast to the ones who made them look. And in the Capitol, where marble often muffled noise, something unexpected began to echo. Not protest, not scandal, but trust inching its way back into the bloodstream of the nation's institutions. For the first time in a long time, people weren't just watching the system. They believed it might finally be watching itself. Far from the city, on a hill just outside Silver Spring, Ibrahim stood alone beside a small headstone shaded by cedar trees. His father's name, Moussa Traoré, was carved in clean stone, the edges worn from weather and time. Beneath it, a line in French, "Ceux qui parlent pour les autres ne meurent jamais." Those who speak for others never truly die. Ibrahim placed a folded piece of paper at the base of the grave, a printout of the Supreme Court's reform statement. He stood in silence for a long time, hands in his pockets, the late sun casting gold across the grass. "I know this wasn't the finish line," he said softly. "I know there's more to fix, more they'll try to hide. But this time, they couldn't." His voice caught for a second. He cleared his throat. "We didn't win everything," he said, eyes never leaving the stone. "But we made them look." A breeze moved through the trees, gentle but insistent, like something old and watching had just nodded. He turned to leave. As he walked back to his car, his phone buzzed with another article link, another quote from a senator praising judicial introspection, another invitation to speak at a university. But he didn't check it. Not yet. Some victories aren't meant for headlines. Some are meant to be carried quietly into whatever comes next. 1 year had passed. Spring sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows of the Howard University Law Building, casting soft amber light over a room full of second-year students. A guest lecture had just ended. Ibrahim stood near the chalkboard, casually rolling his notes, when a young woman, maybe 21, approached him, nervous but steady. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said. "You made me believe law isn't just paper anymore. It's people." He smiled gently. "It's always been people. But sometimes we forget to read between the lines." She nodded and left. Nothing dramatic, no applause, just a moment quiet and genuine. Ibrahim looked around the classroom, newer faces, new questions, but the same spark he remembered seeing in himself years ago. Only now he wore the years more visibly, not older exactly, but changed. Tired, maybe, but not defeated. More at peace than he'd been in a long time. He stepped into the hallway and glanced at the framed photo of Howard alumni on the wall. He wasn't in it, but that was fine. Some names echo louder when they're not etched in stone. The resignation came unexpectedly, a short letter released to the public via the Supreme Court's press office. John Roberts was stepping down. Citing a need for the court to move forward without distraction, the language was polished, legalistic, and sterile. But the undercurrent was clear. The pressure had mounted too long, the fissures had widened too far. Even within the judicial establishment, trust had eroded. But it was the op-ed he published days later in the New York Times that made headlines. History will judge us not by what we wrote, but by what we tried to raise. Some called it an admission. Others called it too little too late. Public opinion split sharply. To many conservatives, his resignation marked the beginning of institutional surrender. To progressives, it was the overdue unraveling of a myth. But to the legal world professors, clerks, analysts, it was something more fundamental. It was a reckoning. Textbooks were revised. Judicial ethics became a required course in law schools. Panels were held not just about Roberts's rulings, but about how influence once hidden could distort the law in silence. His name would still appear in history, but not the way he'd intended. 6 months later, Ibrahim stood in front of a modest brick building in Southeast D.C. The sign was simple: the People's Law Room, legal education, civic power, free for all. Inside, folding chairs, whiteboards, and well-worn textbooks filled the space. Every Saturday, volunteers taught public workshops: how to read a bill, how to challenge a court ruling, how to protect voting rights in your district. Ibrahim taught the first class himself. That morning he had received a letter, no return address. Just Eleanor Whitford's old handwriting on the envelope. She had passed away quietly in her home. The note inside read, "You made them listen, Ibrahim. Don't stop speaking. Loud truth still needs calm voices." He closed the letter gently and placed it in his desk drawer. That night he stood at a small town hall in Maryland, just 40 people seated in a circle. No cameras, no stage, just community. He spoke plainly, not angry, not broken, just hopeful. And as the sun set behind the windows, a little boy near the front row whispered to his mother, "Is he the one who saved the law?" She smiled and said, "No, sweetheart. He just helped it remember what it was for." The echo would remain, and it would grow. In a world where power often hides behind polished titles and complex systems, stories like Ibrahim Traoré's remind us that truth still has a voice, and sometimes that voice comes from the most unexpected places. He didn't fight with anger, but with clarity. He didn't aim to destroy, but to reveal. And in doing so, he reminded millions that justice isn't a monument, it's a living promise, shaped by those who dare to speak up. We may not all stand before Congress, but we each stand before moments where silence feels safer than truth. Traoré chose to speak, not for fame, not for revenge, but because silence would have meant complicity. And that made all the difference. What would it take for you to speak up even when the room is full of people who don't want to hear you? If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Captain of Truth, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Captain of Truth.